In this episode, we're focusing on a skill that becomes incredibly important once security work moves beyond individual judgment and into real organizational decision-making. A risk analysis workshop is one of the simplest ways to bring people together to talk through uncertainty, business impact, and security priorities in a structured setting. For a beginner, that matters because risk is rarely understood well by one person alone, no matter how experienced that person may be. The people who understand the business process, the technology, the data, the operational pressure, and the likely consequences of disruption are often spread across different parts of the organization. A good workshop helps those perspectives meet in one place so the group can build a shared view of what matters most. When conducted well, a workshop is not just a meeting with a security label attached. It becomes a practical decision tool that helps an organization identify meaningful risks, compare them honestly, and decide what should happen next. Risk assessment, at its core, is the process of evaluating uncertainty in a way that helps people act wisely. In security, that usually means looking at a potential threat, a weakness, or an unwanted event and asking what could happen, how likely it is, and how much harm it could cause if it did occur. This sounds straightforward, but the challenge comes from the fact that organizations rarely have perfect information. Attackers change tactics, business conditions shift, data is incomplete, and some types of damage are easier to measure than others. That is why risk assessment is not about predicting the future with total confidence. It is about creating a structured way to judge uncertainty so leaders can prioritize resources and avoid making decisions based only on fear, guesswork, or whatever problem feels most urgent in the moment. Quantitative and qualitative methods are two different ways of bringing that structure to the same underlying problem. A quantitative risk assessment tries to express risk using numbers. Those numbers may represent estimated financial loss, likelihood, frequency, downtime, cost of recovery, or some other measurable form of impact. The central idea is that if you can assign reasonable values to important parts of the problem, you can compare risks more clearly and explain choices in a language many business leaders already understand. For example, a team might estimate the potential cost of a ransomware event by looking at system outage time, labor needed for recovery, outside response support, legal costs, lost revenue, and customer disruption. That approach can be powerful because it gives decision makers something concrete to weigh against the cost of improving a control. Numbers can make risk feel more tangible and can help security teams explain why a certain investment matters. At the same time, quantitative analysis depends heavily on assumptions, data quality, and the realism of the model being used, which means the numbers should support judgment rather than replace it. A qualitative risk assessment works differently because it focuses on structured judgment instead of detailed numerical calculation. Rather than trying to produce a precise dollar estimate or exact probability, it often uses descriptive categories such as low, medium, high, or critical to express severity and priority. A qualitative approach might consider the same core questions as a quantitative one, but it translates them into comparative judgments that are easier to apply when data is limited or when the environment changes too quickly for precise modeling to stay stable. For example, a team might determine that a phishing-related identity compromise risk is high because the organization depends heavily on cloud accounts, executives are frequent targets, and existing user awareness is inconsistent. That conclusion may not include an estimated financial loss figure, but it can still be very useful for prioritizing action. Qualitative assessment is especially common in security because many important risks involve human behavior, uncertain attacker choices, and business consequences that are difficult to calculate neatly even when experienced professionals understand the danger well. The difference between the two methods is not simply numbers versus no numbers. The deeper difference is how each approach expresses confidence and supports decision-making. Quantitative assessment suggests that risk can be framed in terms of magnitude that is at least partly measurable, while qualitative assessment accepts that many security questions are better handled through structured comparison and informed judgment. One method asks, what is the estimated loss range, expected frequency, or probable cost? The other asks, how serious is this relative to other issues, and how urgently should leadership act? This matters because organizations often mistake numerical appearance for greater truth. A calculation that looks precise can still rest on weak assumptions, and a well-reasoned qualitative judgment can sometimes be more trustworthy than a polished spreadsheet built on unstable inputs. Good security leaders do not confuse format with quality. They understand that the usefulness of any assessment depends on how honestly it reflects the information available and how well it helps the business make sensible choices. Quantitative assessments tend to work best when the organization has reasonably reliable data and when the consequences of a risk can be expressed in forms that matter directly to financial or operational planning. If a company wants to compare the cost of adding stronger backup capability against the potential cost of prolonged system downtime, a quantitative approach may be very persuasive. If a team can estimate recovery costs from past incidents, lost productivity during outages, contract penalties, and the financial effect of service interruption, the resulting analysis may support a very clear investment discussion. Numbers can also help when security leaders need to speak with senior executives who are deciding among many competing priorities across the business. A proposal backed by estimated exposure and expected cost reduction may be easier to compare against non-security initiatives. Still, even in these situations, the numbers are only as good as the assumptions behind them. If the estimates are unrealistic, incomplete, or too narrow, the analysis may look rigorous while quietly leading leadership in the wrong direction. Qualitative assessments are often more practical in security because many environments do not provide the kind of complete, stable data that quantitative models prefer. Organizations may know that a risk is important without knowing exactly how often an event will happen or precisely how much every consequence would cost. Consider reputational harm, leadership distraction during a crisis, regulatory scrutiny, customer trust erosion, or damage to strategic relationships. These are all very real consequences, yet they are difficult to reduce to a single clean number without making broad assumptions. Qualitative methods allow security teams to capture that reality without pretending more precision than they truly possess. A good qualitative assessment does not mean vague hand-waving. It means using clear criteria, consistent categories, and thoughtful reasoning to compare risks in a disciplined way. That structure is valuable because it keeps discussions from turning into pure opinion contests while still allowing the organization to act when hard numbers are unavailable or incomplete. One common beginner mistake is assuming that quantitative assessment is automatically better because it uses numbers. That belief is understandable, since numbers often create an impression of authority and objectivity. However, a risk calculation can be misleading if the input values are little more than guesses dressed up to look exact. For example, if a team assigns a loss estimate, attack frequency, and probability of success without credible basis, the final number may appear precise while actually hiding a lot of uncertainty. In that case, the model can create false confidence instead of better decision-making. A well-run qualitative session may produce a more honest and more useful answer because the people involved are openly discussing business dependence, control weakness, threat conditions, and uncertainty rather than pretending they know more than they do. This does not make numbers bad. It means that good risk assessment values sound reasoning more than decorative precision. The question should never be whether the output looks impressive. The question should be whether the output helps leaders understand the situation and choose an appropriate response. Another common misconception is that qualitative assessment is lazy or informal. In reality, strong qualitative assessment can be highly disciplined when the criteria are defined clearly and applied consistently. A team might rate impact by considering data sensitivity, business interruption, legal exposure, financial consequence, and customer effect. It might rate likelihood by considering threat interest, ease of exploitation, existing controls, historical patterns, and how exposed the system is to misuse. If those criteria are documented and understood, then a rating of high or medium is not arbitrary. It represents a structured judgment built from shared definitions. This matters because consistency is one of the most important qualities in risk management. Leaders need to trust that similar risks are being evaluated in similar ways across departments, technologies, and business units. Without that consistency, even the most careful discussions can produce confusing results. A qualitative approach becomes much stronger when categories are anchored to business meaning instead of being treated as loose labels that different people interpret differently from one meeting to the next. To make this distinction clearer, imagine two different organizations facing a similar risk. Both rely heavily on cloud-based collaboration systems, and both are concerned about account takeover caused by phishing. The first organization has rich incident data, clear cost tracking, mature records of outage impact, and enough history to estimate how often account-related events occur and what recovery tends to cost. That environment supports a stronger quantitative analysis because the team can connect likely events to measurable operational and financial consequences. The second organization is growing quickly and lacks that historical detail. It still understands that an account compromise could expose sensitive information, interrupt operations, and damage trust, but it cannot estimate those outcomes with the same numerical confidence. In that case, a qualitative analysis may be more honest and more useful. Both organizations can make good decisions, but they are using different methods because their information environments are different, not because one is serious and the other is careless. Many organizations use a risk matrix as part of qualitative assessment, and this is worth understanding because it is one of the most common tools in practice. A risk matrix typically compares likelihood and impact using categories, then maps the result to an overall rating such as low, moderate, or high. This approach is simple enough to be widely understood, which is one reason it remains popular. It allows teams from different backgrounds to participate in a common conversation and can support prioritization when detailed quantitative modeling is not practical. The weakness, however, is that a matrix can oversimplify if people treat the final color or category as more meaningful than the reasoning that produced it. Two risks labeled high may not be equally urgent, and different people may interpret the same category differently if the organization has not defined terms carefully. A matrix is useful as a communication aid, not as a substitute for thinking. The real value comes from the discussion around the rating and from whether the organization uses the tool consistently over time. Quantitative approaches also come in more than one form, and beginners should understand that not all numeric assessments are equally sophisticated. Some organizations use simple financial estimates to compare likely loss against the cost of a control improvement. Others build more detailed models that consider uncertainty ranges, different possible scenarios, and changing assumptions. Regardless of the method, the same principle applies. Good quantitative work depends on input quality, clarity about assumptions, and a willingness to admit what remains unknown. It is better to present a reasonable range than to force a single exact number that implies certainty the team does not truly have. It is also wise to remember that some consequences are easy to count and some are not. Lost sales, recovery labor, and contract penalties may be easier to estimate than damaged trust, leadership distraction, or long-term strategic harm. That does not mean the harder-to-measure consequences should be ignored. It means quantitative analysis should be complemented by narrative explanation so leaders understand where the numbers are strong and where professional judgment still matters. In practice, the best security programs often combine quantitative and qualitative methods rather than choosing one forever. A qualitative assessment may help identify and rank risks quickly across a broad environment, while a more quantitative approach may later be applied to a smaller number of high-priority decisions that involve meaningful investment or major business trade-offs. This combined approach works well because it respects both efficiency and depth. Qualitative methods help teams move through uncertainty without becoming paralyzed by lack of data, and quantitative methods can add financial clarity when more detailed justification is needed. For example, leadership may first identify ransomware resilience, privileged access weakness, and vendor concentration as top-tier concerns through qualitative assessment. Then, when deciding how much to invest in backup recovery improvement or identity control enhancement, the organization may use quantitative estimates to compare likely costs and expected benefits. This blended model is often the most realistic because security management rarely has the luxury of perfect data or unlimited time, yet still needs to support serious business decisions with as much clarity as possible. Communication is another reason the distinction matters, because different audiences often respond differently to each style of assessment. Financial leaders may appreciate numerical ranges, cost estimates, and expected loss discussions because those fit familiar business language. Operational leaders may respond more strongly to qualitative explanations tied to downtime, workflow disruption, customer effect, or control weakness. Boards and executives often need both. They want a clear view of which risks matter most, but they also want enough explanation to trust that the assessment was not built on unsupported assumptions. A security manager should therefore think not only about how the analysis is performed, but also about how the result will be understood. A technically accurate assessment that nobody can interpret well will not drive good decisions. The best presentations translate the findings into business meaning. They explain what the risk is, why it matters now, what the organization knows with confidence, what remains uncertain, and what options leadership has for responding. That communication skill is often just as important as the assessment method itself. A mature approach to risk assessment also recognizes that risk is dynamic rather than static. Whether the organization uses numbers, categories, or a blend of both, the results should not be treated as permanent truth. Business priorities change, threat activity changes, control maturity changes, and new dependencies can alter the significance of a risk very quickly. A moderate issue today can become a major issue tomorrow if a system becomes customer-facing, if attackers begin targeting it more actively, or if a protective control weakens. That means both quantitative and qualitative assessments need periodic review. A financial estimate from last year may no longer reflect the business. A qualitative rating assigned during one stage of growth may lose meaning after a merger, a cloud migration, or a major shift in data handling. Good security leaders revisit assumptions and recalibrate their assessments instead of treating them as fixed scores carved in stone. Risk assessment is most valuable when it remains connected to the current reality of the organization, not just to the conditions that existed when the document was first created. By the end of this discussion, the central idea should be much clearer. Quantitative risk assessment uses numbers to estimate exposure, compare options, and support decisions in financially familiar terms, while qualitative risk assessment uses structured judgment and defined categories to evaluate risk when exact data is limited or when broader business meaning matters more than numerical precision. Neither approach is automatically superior in every case. Each has strengths, limits, and a proper place in security management. Quantitative methods can add clarity and persuasive power when good data exists, but they can mislead when assumptions are weak. Qualitative methods can be flexible, honest, and highly practical, but they must be disciplined to avoid inconsistency. The strongest security leaders know when to use each method and when to combine them. More importantly, they remember that the real purpose of risk assessment is not to produce attractive charts or clever formulas. It is to help the organization understand uncertainty well enough to make better decisions before harm arrives.
Thanks for listening. For more audio courses, daily newsletters, and more, please visit baremetalcyber.com.